Hello everybody. I would just like to welcome everybody now to Algebra 2 Trig. I know it's been a long road through geometry. We've been at it since September and we've covered quite a bit of ground. And we've done a lot of proofs. We've done quite a bit of theorems and postulates. And I know it's been a lot. If you take away nothing else from geometry, please remember the 30, 60, 90 right triangle and the 45, 45, 90 right triangle, as well as the different theorems and postulates about parallel lines and angles. Those are very important for what's coming up. So, now that we're in Algebra 2, the idea is to advance our knowledge of algebra because the next course after this is pre-calculus, which will start bridging us to go into higher maths such as calculus and differential equations and linear algebra and so on. But Algebra 2 is going to be a return to algebra. So for those of you who weren't so fond of geometry, who preferred algebra, this is more exactly what you're looking for. Back to classic algebra, but with some more advanced stuff. So, Algebra 2 is going to start out a little slow. We will start out with linear equations. Like our very first lesson is going to be on linear inequalities. I'm not going to waste your time solving basic linear equations. The book I'm using would have me even doing some basic math lessons again and some pre-algebra stuff. I'm not here to waste your time on that stuff. No, that's not my goal. You already have a grasp on that if you've come to Algebra 2. I figure you got plenty of a good grasp on that. But we are going to talk about, of course, linear inequalities, absolute value equations and inequalities. We'll talk more about linear functions and their graphs. We're going to also introduce piecewise functions, which are different from anything we've done before yet. We'll talk about the greatest integer functions. We'll talk about absolute value functions and their graphs. We'll talk about systems of linear equations and inequalities in 2D and in 3D, so in 2 variables and in 3 variables. We're also going to talk about matrices, like the basic operations of matrices and what they are. We will talk about determinants in Cramer's rule with matrices. We'll talk about identity and inverse matrices. We'll talk about quadratic functions in their graphs. We're even going to get into imaginary numbers. So up till now, we've been dealing with real numbers. We are going to introduce imaginary numbers. There is such a thing. It's the square root of -1. That's the imaginary number I, which we'll get more into that at the time. But together, the real and imaginary numbers make up part of what's called the complex number system. So we're going to start looking not only at the real number system, we're going to look at the complex number system as a whole and include imaginary numbers in our results. We will even do quadratic inequalities. We'll learn how to solve those. We'll talk about polynomial functions and their operations and their graphs, and solving polynomial functions of higher degrees than 2. We'll even have 3rd degree equations, 4th degree equations we'll solve. We'll talk about the end behavior of polynomial graphs. We will talk about the remainder theorems, the factor theorems. We will review polynomial long division. We're going to introduce synthetic division also. What else? We'll talk about rational zeros as a way of solving higher order equations such as 3rd and 4th degree, maybe even a couple 5th degree equations. We will talk about the fundamental theorem of algebra. And then we're going to move beyond square roots. We're going to talk about what's called the nth roots, such as the cube roots, the 4th roots, the 5th roots, so on. We're also going to introduce rational exponents, meaning you could have an exponent that's a fraction. We're going to go over what those mean. What else are we going to discuss? I have a list here. We're going to talk about inverse functions. So I know towards the end of geometry we talked about one-to-one functions. Well, that ties in with inverse functions here in Algebra 2. We're going to talk about square and cube root functions and their graphs. We'll also talk about radical equations. Then we're going to get into exponential and logarithmic functions and their graphs, and some exponential and logarithmic equations. What else? Rational equations and functions. We'll talk about those, and asymptotes and all those type of things. We'll talk about conic sections. We did touch on conic sections very briefly in geometry when we talked about circles. That's a type of conic section. But we're also going to talk about not only circles, we'll talk about ellipses, hyperbolas, parabolas, and then given a quadratic equation of two variables, determining whether that's the equation of a circle, an ellipse, a parabola, a hyperbola, so on. What else? We will talk about quadratic systems of equations. Those will be introduced. We're going to get into sequences and series. So I'm sure some of you have seen this notation before. That's for a series. That is the capital Greek letter sigma. That's for summations. We will even introduce that later in the course. What else? We'll talk about the binomial theorem. So the binomial theorem, a brief description of that is, let's say I have something like x plus y to the third power, to the fourth power, to the fifth power, to the 10th power, what have you. The binomial theorem enables me to expand those beyond just the second power. Yes, it is applied to the second power, and actually you've already learned it to the second power. You should know how to expand basic linear equations to the second power by now, but you're going to learn how to do it to the third power and to the higher powers. We will talk about permutations and combinations and factorials. So, brief example of factorials, right? You just have the number 3. I definitely need a new black marker, as I said in the last lesson of geometry. It's about time I get on that. But let's say, for example, I just have the number 3. But it's just the number 3. Now, if I have 3 exclamation mark, that exclamation mark is called a factorial. And that means something completely different than the number 3. We'll get into what numbers with exclamation marks means. Those are called factorials, but those relate to permutations and combinations. So that's it for the Algebra 2 side of it. This course is also contained trigonometry. We will get into trig ratios and functions. Of course, your sine, your cosine, your tangent. But there are 3 reciprocal functions of those too. We didn't go over them in geometry, but we're going to go over them in Algebra 2 trig. You have the secant function, which is just the reciprocal of the cosine. You have the cosecant function, which is the reciprocal of the sine function. And then you have the cotangent function, which is the reciprocal of the tangent function. So we're also going to cover those. We will also not only work in degrees, we're going to work in what's called radians. We will convert from radians to degrees and get familiar with that. We'll talk about the unit circle. We'll talk about inverse trigonometric functions. Then we'll also talk about the law of sines, the law of cosines. We'll get into parametric equations. We'll get into trig identities and then graphs of trigonometric functions, and then even solve some trigonometric equations. So all I've talked about are things you will find in an Algebra 2 trig course. And largely that's actually what's in pre-calculus. When we get to pre-calculus, which should be sometime late March or April, we should get on to pre-calculus. That'll be the next level after this. It's almost going to seem like a regurgitation of Algebra 2 trig, but there are other things that are not taught in Algebra 2 trig that are taught in pre-calculus, especially deeper in the trig realm. and getting into a little bit of limits and derivatives, which are stuff you'd more find towards calculus. So they're in polar coordinates and stuff, which are in pre-calculus. We'll learn all about that. But in this course, you'll also learn how to graph in 3D a little bit. We'll do just a little bit of 3D graphing. So stay tuned for that. And again, I know this course is going to start out slow. Some of you are going to be like, really? This feels like Algebra 1 again. Well, we do review a bit of Algebra 1. But I'm not going to spend an exuberant amount of time on Algebra 1 topics. It's just going to be a brief review in passing. Because by the time you get here to Algebra 2 Trig, you should have a pretty good grasp on Algebra 1 topics. But the very first lesson that we're going to do for the next lesson here will be linear inequalities. So I hope everyone has a good night. And thank you to everybody again who subscribed to me, who's commented, reacted to my videos. I appreciate all of you very much. I couldn't do this without you guys. You guys make this worthwhile. You guys drive me to want to do this every day. Even on days when I'm just tired and just, don't really feel like it, I do this for you guys. This is free. This always will be. You have all my videos in the playlist all the way back from Basic Math 1 all the way up through Geometry, and they are completely free. Review them anytime. And now we're about to add Algebra 2 Trig stuff to this also. So I thank you all again. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. It'll help my channel grow. And you all are amazing. Thank you so much. Have a good one.